All right, we're going to go ahead and begin learning about the basics of server-side programming. And one thing that you're going to have as part of your development package for this course is to make sure you install Windows, Apache, MySQL, and PHP, WAMP server. There's other ones that are like that, but what it does is it essentially installs everything that you need to develop server-side programming, such as your Apache web server. Your Apache web server is installed. Your PHP, PHP, and all the linkages you need to run your PHP as server-sided scripting. It also install a database for you that you can also work with within this tool. Um, this tool pop up for WAMP server. So when you get that installed, you're going to be starting to play around with here. And here's PHP myadmin. That's really kind of cool because it brings up everything that your local server is running, and you can log in to the database to manage the database from here. But essentially what Windows, Apache, MySQL, and PHP does is it installs all those programs, PHP, MySQL, um, and Apache server, and makes it so that all the linkages happen. And I'm going to talk to you about what I'm talking about when I say linkages. So we're going to get into a little bit of some history on server-side programming, and we're going to get at a low level so you really understand what it is. Because it's actually stupid simple. It's just hard to kind of figure out on your own. And that's what the main idea of today is for you guys to get that, understand that low level, big idea understanding of what server-sided scripting is. So let's start with a little bit of a diagram, and then we're going to get in and start having a little bit of fun later on in the video. So the diagram we're going to talk about is just one that I found on the web, and it's based on your client side and server-sided infrastructure. So essentially, your client side, that's going to be all your client side. That's going to be your HTML, essentially your HTML, and your JavaScript. That's pretty much what it is right now. That's what most clients have. So your HTML, JavaScript are going to be on the client side. Now your server side will do this. It will print using standard output HTML and JavaScript, and that print command that outputs the HTML and JavaScript, because you're writing code that actually writes code. That's what server-sided programming is. That HTML JavaScript is what's sent to the client to render. So when you are on server-sided scripting, you're actually writing a program. Instead of creating an HTML page where you statically put in the HTML code, you're writing a program that dynamically outputs the HTML and the JavaScript with just a simple print line command. So let's give you, for instance, standard output. Standard output is any kind of print command that you have in one of your programming languages that outputs to your black command window, your console. And languages such as Python, they don't really do standard output because they're interpreted, but they have the print command, C, print command, C++, the cout command. Java, C# is console.writeline. Java, I think, is console.writeline. But anyways, wherever you got that output, other languages would call it console.log. But you can actually use any language. It does not matter what language you use to print your HTML tags in JavaScript dynamically so that it can be rendered over here. So there's a few rules that you got to understand about what's going on when you build this program that just basically writes code dynamically for you. And one thing is when this client comes up underneath the server, they come up underneath an Apache ID, an Apache user ID. So the Apache user, is actually a user on the system. This is the huge main important thing. When a client connects to the server, they actually come in under a username on that server. And that username, if you're going through port 80, it's going to run under Apache user. So they actually have a user created on the system called Apache user, or whatever they call it. And that user on the system is actually the client that's connecting. So they actually connect underneath that user without login credentials or anything. It just all happens through port 80 automatically when you config. So when you are running your executable that is printing your HTML and your JavaScript tags dynamically to your client, that executable is running with the Apache user credentials on the system, meaning that it only has access to specific folders on the system that is serving the website. And if it's an Apache, if it's a service username such as Apache, then let me, because I kind of lost my train of thought there, but in any case, the Apache username, or the Apache user, is the user that is run on the system. So that means that you have to have specific credentials for that executable, whatever executable that you create here, or script, executable or script. We're going to start with executables because that's the where everything started. And then we're going to go into scripts and why scripts, because mostly server-side programming is scripting now. We don't do much of the executable part of it anymore. But it's still the same concept. It's just done with an interpreter versus a compiler. When you are running or you are writing, or this executable is running, it is given that username, which means that username needs to have executable, that username needs to have privileges on the executable that is running in its directory. First, you have to have, the user has to have the ability to read the executable you create that prints your HTML and your JavaScript. But that's the kind of the idea, is that you have to have this linkage made so that anything in the directory that you create, especially like an executable that prints your HTML, your web user has read, write, or executable privileges over that particular program. So not only do you have your executable, but you have the user that is running the executable on the server. That's the key of understanding everything and how it works. Because you are going to be printing these HTML and JavaScript code, this code, using your program or executable, and the client is going to render that. But the client has to come in and invoke the executable through an address. So in old school days, we used to put it an address, and we'll just put this, we'll just call it www.site.com. And they used to put it in what's called CGI-bin. Then they would have, and let's call the executable home. Now, this would be usually on a Unix system, so you wouldn't need the .exe, but I'm going to throw it in here. And by the way, if you're using Python, it's going to be .php. So because you can do an executable with any language you want, but you wouldn't actually put the .exe on the end, but it is an executable, and I'm just putting it there. So it would just be home, but if you're on like a Windows system, it would be home.exe. Yes, extreme security problems. That's why we no longer do this technology anymore. But to understand all of it, you have to start at the beginning to understand how the server-side scripting actually, how it behaves, because it's just essentially the same idea of this. So you would take that executable And that's what the user would access. They would run this URL, and they would click on this link. And when they actually clicked on that home.exe, when that came up, it would run the executable under the client user, which happens to be Apache user. So you're actually running an executable or an interpretation of a script. When that client comes in and accesses that that URL that includes that executable, they're actually running the program, and that program will then run under this user ID. So that means that that user ID has to have access to privileges to a directory on the server, for read, write, and executable privileges. And that directory is automatically done for you. And all the linkages that need to be done, such as the Apache configuration and whatnot to make it work appropriately, are all done for you by Windows, Apache, MySQL, and PHP. We're learning how to do server-sided scripting. We're not going to be learning how to set up our own servers. So when you do get into a working environment, you will be given this information from your network administrators, or you can go ahead and create your own stuff. That's totally appropriate and might be the best way to learn. This is what all the linkages is set up for us. Is it sets up basically what we call the www directory. And underneath that www directory, we give Apache user privileges. Read privileges. If we want to, we give it write privileges, but that's kind of not very safe. But this Apache user has access to anything in our www directory, which happens to be the directory where our web pages are going to be in, and which actually refer to the site. So when you say www.site.com on the server, at that site.com without all this other stuff, it's in the www directory. Now, if you went into the www directory and put CGI bin, and you would find your home.exe in your own files. So we built our own server. So if we want to get into our server files, we'll go down here to Windows, Apache, MySQL, WAMP 64 on C drive. And then you get your www directory. So if you want to change anything on your website that you've created, you could do it through here, or your server that you created. You could do it through here and change this index.php. And when you bring up your website, your local host, which is essentially your www directory. That's your www directory. So everything here in localhost is showing up from your www directory. And that index.php, that's what's coming up and being run for your localhost address. So you've created your own server, and it has all the linkages for connecting to your database and setting up your user for your Apache user ID to have privileges over that www directory, so that you can then run executable or scripts or server-sided scripting in that directory that the client will invoke through the URL. Wow, that was enough for me. Okay, so here's the big takeaway. Server-side scripting. You can use any language you want. It does not matter. As long as you use, the goal that you're doing is you're just basically printing HTML and JavaScript code. You're writing a program that writes a program. And I always kind of get a little bit cheeky, so I say, if you're writing a program that writes JavaScript code and your JavaScript code writes HTML, then you're writing a program that writes a program that writes a program. And that's where your extra credit comes from, because it's actually really silly. You never really do things that way because you don't need to, because you're on the server side. You only need to do use dynamic, the dynamics of JavaScript when JavaScript is the right solution. Other than that, you already got dynamic web page capabilities just by doing your print commands in your executable or your script. Okay, so here's where we're going to get a little bit more hands-on. The big takeaway is everything that you do on server-sided scripting runs under a user ID. That user ID is dependent on the server, and it's right in the services, so that when your client comes in at port 80 and invokes a URL on your server, they actually come in under this user. That's their username. They're on the system as that user, which means that they're only given privileges for that user. And this user is automatically given privileges over the www directory, which is where your web pages will be, static web pages that have the extension .html, and also dynamic web pages that will have no extension because it's an executable, or it will have a PHP extension because it's a script, and it's a script-based server-side program. But they're the same thing. Just one is compiled and the other is interpreted. They do the same jobs. So server-side programming is basically just code that writes code. That's it. That's how it works. And the idea here is, since this executable, this output, this executable is printing and running on the server, that means that executable has access to all the data on the server. So that could be files. So you're going to start out by building your own file database, where that's the old school way of using files as a database. And then towards the end of the quarter, you're going to learn how to hook up to the database given to you. So that executable has access to data on the server, so they can dynamically print HTML tags that include that data. That simple. It could be files on the server. It could be a database on the server. It could be a database on a whole nother server that only this server has authentication on. And that's where you get your security. And the other aspect of security is where you put that information. You do not put your data in your www directory. You're going to start out like that. Yes, you're going to start out that way because we're starting out with you creating databases files. That's how you're going to begin. But you don't put your data in your www directory. You'll put it somewhere else, and you will read access to the Apache user to that information that's on some other directory on the server. That way you can protect it, because when the user comes in on the site, they have access to pretty much everything that's in the www directory, depending on the access type, read, write, or execute. So you need executable privileges for this particular user on the server to access the data that's also on the server, and to run the executable that dynamically prints the HTML tags and also accesses the information. Server-sided scripting in under, 15 minutes or so? Well, maybe not. This gets a little bit more difficult than this, because in practice, it's here's the issue: is you're writing code that writes code, and that's the problem. We're going to start with an executable that we're going to create, and I want you guys to use the programming language that you're comfortable with. I'm going to go ahead and demo it two ways. We're going to use C++ as an executable, because I'm going to talk about history again, and then we're going to use Python. And you guys can use whatever you want. You're going to be starting PHP and coming up here. I want you to use something you're comfortable with for this, because I want to basically show you the mechanism of that print, how that actually works. Because that standard output, when you print HTML tags, is directed to you through port 80. So what does that look like and how it works? Well, it's actually really simple. You just literally have a program that prints a web page. So we're going to do it, and then we're going to kind of simulate the action that's going on behind the scenes by copying and pasting the code that we print into Notepad, and then just saving it as an HTML file to test if our printing, our dynamic printing of HTML tags actually renders shows a renderable web page on a web browser. And that's your first assignment. So let's go ahead and get that started. We're going to cheat a little bit, but not too much. I'm going to start in, we're going to go back and forth between C++ and Python on the different print commands. You can do whichever one you feel comfortable with. I would suggest to go ahead and just do in Python because you don't have to have a main function. But one thing I also want to kind of point out is when you have an executable, you could or an interpretation, your program itself can accept default arguments, and so look into default arguments of Python scripts and PHP function arguments, and actually, you know what? Just look into argc, argv. That's what default arguments are for executables. All right, so we're going to get our hands dirty a little bit. I just brought up a real quick, simple web page that's automatically generated in NetBeans. And what we're going to do is we're going to use print commands to do this web page. We're probably I'm gonna go ahead and get rid of this metadata. We don't really need that. And let's go ahead and write it in Python first, since I'm pretty sure that you guys will be comfortable with that. And then we'll take that and we'll modify it. And I'll give you a little bit of example of how that works with an executable. And we'll take that executable output and work with it. So let's go ahead and get into Python here. And we're going to start with our first print command. Our first print command is going to need to output this HTML tag. Now, you actually would, when you're actually really building this, you would actually build functions that would print the header, print the body, print the footer of your web pages, because this is actually how Facebook is built. So you're going to be learning how to build your own Facebook in this course, if you wish. So what we'll start out with first is print, and this is where we have to print the HTML. Now, here's the problem with writing code that writes code, and that is, well, how do I do a backslash or any of the formatting characters? And that's where you would get with what we call escape sequences. So if you want to print a backslash, you do a double backslash. You know, if you want to print basically a double colon, you do a backslash in front of it. So these escape sequences allow us to write code that writes code. So because of those particular special formatters, and that's what makes it difficult. That's the hard part of server-side scripting. So what we're going to do here is we're going to print our HTML tag. Okay, and we're going to go ahead and print the end of that. And we're going to do, I believe, I think we have to do head here. Head, yeah, head. Okay, and backslash head. All right. And let's see, inside the head, let's do a title. And then let's print some information inside the title. And again, this would all be in functions and stuff like print header, print body, print footer, that sort of thing. Oh, I forgot my double quotes here. And then we're going to go ahead and take this guy, and we're going to add our body. But let's print a hello world. There we go. You know what? I think that's enough. Oh, no, it's just the title. So now let's just do a body real quick. We'll do it all in one line, though. Okay, now Python is making this easy for us probably. Because you see this right here, this backslash, that's a formatter. That's going to be a problem. Other languages, we'd have to do 2 forward slashes. This other one here, 2 forward slashes and 2 forward slashes. Python probably will not be an issue with this. We'll see. Let's go ahead and, because what we'll do is we'll look at the output. And this is all just strings. That's all you're doing when you're doing server-side programming. You're literally just printing strings to standard output. And the strings that you're printing happen to be HTML and JavaScript code. And that's what's being directed to the browser of your client when it hits your executable or your interpreted page or your server-side scripting page, is that string. And that's what the get command is through your normal port 80 protocols. So that should be enough for us to test it. Let's go ahead and run it. Run without debugging. Okay. Looks like it's being a stinker. Okay, there's our output. Okay, so this is the output that is going to be directed. So this output. So let's go back to our little thing. So when you go to that website that has your server-side script on it, it runs, and then that output is what's sent. That output that we see here in our Python script. Oops, if I can get to the right page. This output right here, that's sent when they access that executable or server-side script. That's sent to the client, and that's what's rendered in the browser. So you're basically just writing code that writes the code that's rendered in the browser. And your executable or your interpreted script is what does that dynamic printing of the code through standard output. Now, it looks like Python is not having a trouble with that backslash. And let's see, I might have done the wrong backslash. Maybe that's a forward slash. Did I do it wrong? Let's go ahead and look and cheat real quick. No, I did the right slash. Okay. So other languages, which I'm going to demonstrate, do not do so well with this, which is why interpreted languages are more popular than executables, and why we've started using interpreters. That's one of the reasons. There's more reasons than that I'm going to talk about soon. Okay, so let's go ahead and we're just going to go ahead and just paste this here. And this is going to be our HTML output. Oh, we forgot one major problem. We got to do this. We got to do this doc type HTML. That is going to cause a big issue. Because the goal here is I want you to put it into just your output, all your output into the HTML file and test it. So we're going to actually do that with Notepad because this is cheating a little bit. So let's go ahead and do add that print command. For our output. Okay. Okay, so now we're going to test it to make sure that it can be rendered. Our output can be rendered in a web browser. So I'm going to take our output code that we printed dynamically, and I'm going to just go to my desktop and create a quick notepad, or I'm just going to go ahead and go in here and just say new text document, and we're going to call this test, and then call it dot. You want to change the extension. So if you haven't done that before, let me go ahead and show you how to do that. I just named it test.txt for now. What we need to do is I'm going to go to the desktop, and there's my test.txt. You need to say view file name extensions, and make sure you do that. And then you can open it, and let's just edit in Notepad and put our output code in there. And then after we do that, let's just rename it .html or HTML. Okay, now we're going to test to see if our output renders. I don't see any errors. I think it rendered appropriately. Let's go ahead and view source and see if there's any errors. It looks like it ran properly. So that's server-side scripting, guys. It's really that easy. The mechanisms that are happening, that are set up for you, that are installed for you, are basically setting up that Apache, MySQL, and PHP, setting up the relationships with the directory structure to the Apache user ID, so that your www directory, your Apache user has access over that. What we're going to be doing is, instead of home.exe, it's home.php. But what you would take is, you would take your executable and put it in there, and it would run. You wouldn't have .exe on it. It would just be home. But the way PHP is configured through the Apache, we call it home.php, or just simple index.php. And CGI bin is no longer out there. You might see some old school websites that are there, but here's why we do not do scripting with executables. The number one issue is escape sequences. So some languages we use server-side scripting for, other languages we do not. Executables are not a good solution for server-side scripting. However, it can be done, and it is done. There are some solutions that require an executable of some language or another. But if you're working in a more difficult language, such as C, you would have a lot more of a problem, because in C, your standard output, you use the standard out, or you use the cout command, or that's C++, or the print command, that's C. So when I do my HTML here, my HTML tag, I'm going to have a problem when I close out the tag, because in almost all languages, a backslash is an escape character. Python allows it. Interpreted languages let you get away with it because they know kind of what you mean, and they help you too much. But here, what you got to say is, no, I'm not trying to format by doing a new line or a carriage return. I actually really want you to print a backslash. So then you just do another backslash. If you want them to print the quote, you have to do quotes quite a bit when you're writing code that writes code. And in this case, we just want to do a double backslash. And then this would work fine, except for, you notice that the different type of code here is that escape sequence, so that we're telling it that the compiler, we're actually trying to output a backslash and not trying to actually do a format, some kind of formatting that the compiler would read to complete, such as inserting a tab before the HTML. So that's what the formatting characters do. And that's what the problem is writing code by code. With an executable, it makes it more difficult. It makes it more difficult because you always have to be cognizant of this fact. Now if I wanted to output this in this manner, let's see. It looks like there's issues here that I'll have to look into, and let's make sure that we can actually get this to work. But it looks like it doesn't look like, oh, is it backslash? Yeah, it's backslash. Oh my god, I'm doing the wrong slash. In any case, escape sequences. When you're writing code that writes code, it causes problems. So make sure you remember those escape sequences. So it's going to be that for actually outputting the double quote or the double quote. If you want a format, you notice here where we got the double quote, that's formatting what we consider a string. But what if I just want to output, if I'm writing code that writes code and I just want to output a double quote, that's when we use that escape sequence. And we're saying here, hey, we're not formatting here. We're not formatting. I want you to actually output the double quote. And that's one of the more difficult aspects of server-sided programming when you're dealing with more difficult languages, because you can use any language. It doesn't matter what language you have. You just configure it, and the executable or the interpretation runs, and the output, the standard output, is sent to your browser to be rendered, like I demonstrated for you here. I'm not going to go too much further into this. We would build this and save it as an executable, and then put that in the www directory to dynamically output our web page. I think the Python example is good enough for you guys to get the big idea. Last thing about executables and why we don't use executables and why we use interpreted languages for server-sided scripting. Executables are rigid. That means that number one, they are error prone, and when an error happens, typically the executable just crashes. So you got these executables that are running when a client comes in on a web page that are running in the background on a server, and often the server would get overwhelmed with programs crashing and multiple instances of the program running, all kinds of issues like that. So when you think about JavaScript and server-sided programming, JavaScript is one of the main things about JavaScript, and why it's widely used for server-sided or for client-sided programming is because it can basically recover from errors a lot easier than a particular executable. So when you're using an interpreted language, it's a little bit more bulletproof. And we want that because the whole reason for the web and web pages to exist, or actually the whole beginning of the invention of the web, is to have the capability of getting information difficultly. Meaning that you could lose one node on the internet and another node would pick up to give you that information that you need. So it's basically the whole web is a system based on the capability to have failure. So essentially, we want to write server-sided scripts because most likely there's going to be code in there that goes and turns to poop and doesn't work anymore. And we don't want the whole program to crash, just that part of the code to not work. And interpreted code, it will happily try code, and if it doesn't work, ignore it and move on. So it doesn't crash as prevalently as an executable-based server-side script. And that's why that's another reason why we use server-sided scripting. Also, debugging. Debugging is almost impossible to do. It's very difficult to do since you're running an executable on the server. through the client user. When you're testing the code that you build, you're going to be testing through your client user. So you're going to be testing through the web browser, your code that you write that runs under your Apache user. There's a lot of issues that go along with that. Okay, I think we are good for this beginning, the basics of server-sided programming. Code that writes code running underneath a user code or a program that outputs dynamic HTML, the dynamic HTML and JavaScript language to standard output called from a client user and run under the Apache, or a client run under the Apache user of the system that prints the HTML and any data associated on the server that's necessary to your client. All right. Any other reasons why we don't use executables instead of interpreters? I think I covered all of them, and I got through most of my goals that I wanted to for this first video. Here's your assignment. You're going to add more to this. So use whatever language you want, but you're going to be adding more to this program that prints, and I want you to print it using your standard output of whatever program you choose. I don't care. And once you print it, I want a screenshot of your output, and then I want you to take that output and test it in an HTML file like I showed you how to do with your notepad. And render it. Open up that file, make sure it renders with what you need to add to your HTML document for your assignment. And you'll see that as part of the assignment. All right, thank you.